This morning, I'm going to be sharing the message with Mark and Becky Stormont. They have been ministry leaders in our Celebrate Recovery literally almost since day one. It got handed off to them very quickly. They were reluctant servants. They'll tell you about that here in a minute. I have had the privilege for 15 of those years to walk with them in their leadership, and I'm so thankful to have been able to see it up close and personal. There's one thing in particular, well, there's a couple things, but one thing in particular I want to highlight that is not often seen by those in the public, and how difficult it is to lead any ministry, let alone a Celebrate Recovery ministry. And it is the thing I think that Mark and Becky both take very seriously, which is to be guardians of the principles and the idea and how the ministry is structured, and not to compromise on how things need to be done in a God-honoring way. Let me tell you what the hardest thing in ministry, in any ministry, is to bring discipline to the difficult situations. And me being one of them, people in recovery are difficult people sometimes. Does anyone out there want to give testimony to that truth? We're a squirrely bunch. And Mark and Becky have had many times behind the scenes dealing with things in the smallest circles possible, leading with grace and dignity and truth. And I'm so thankful. There's been so many of those times where we have sat and had those very private conversations about how to lead and lead through it. So you might all intuitively recognize this, but to be leaders of any ministry for 20 years, they're super volunteers. You know, they don't do this for financial support. So they have been volunteering all these 20 years. But to be a leader of any ministry for any length of time is difficult, let alone 20 years. So today we not only celebrate Recovery, but we celebrate 20 years of leadership, and in case you hadn't heard yet, the handing off of the ministry. Mark and Becky will be stepping out of leadership effective today. I tried to take the keys away from them this morning, but they reminded me it's not till this evening. So would you join me in welcoming Mark and Becky to share the message this morning? All right. Well, let's get started with one of the first principles that those who participate in Celebrate Recovery know it, but maybe not everybody else. One of the hallmarks of a healthy Celebrate Recovery ministry, Mark and Becky often remind me and have blessed me and also my predecessors, is that senior pastor support is critical for a healthy ministry. And for many years, you know, I appreciated their honoring me in that and encouraging me in that. But in the last several years, that principle has become full circle for me in particular. I have a recovery background. Many of you have heard that story before I came here as senior pastor, but in 2015, things kind of train wrecked a little bit. And some of you will remember this. There was a lot of things going on in my life. One of the big things was my brother had passed away, and I wasn't dealing with that in the right way. And my drug of choice is the one that is publicly acceptable for sure, is sugar. And in 12 months, I gained 60 pounds. Some of you watched The Ascent. Most of you were gracious not to say anything. Most of you. We can laugh about it now, right? Or we'll cry. I realize it's going to be a lifelong battle, but in 2015, I returned to my recovery roots and I was always around Celebrate Recovery, but I became a regular participant again, and did my first step study. Mark was my leader, and then he also was my sponsor, the person who walks with you, in particular through your step 4, but really in working all the steps. And senior pastor support for me means support from the Celebrate Recovery ministry as well for the senior pastor. So grateful and thankful for both of you, as so many others can attest to, your personal sacrifice and your blessing and the ways that you have so sacrificially led behind the scenes. You may not comprehend it to think about 20 years of ministry, but a very conservative estimate of the amount of time these two have dedicated. I want you to think about it with me. If you work, and this is on the low side, just 20 hours a week in the ministry, which they have done for more than that for years and years and years. But if it's just 20 hours a week between the two of them, over the last 20 years, they have given 40,000 volunteer hours to Celebrate Recovery. We honor you and thank you for that. So let's talk about why, Mark. You actually had your breaking point, your coming to Christ moment that prepared you for Celebrate Recovery ministry, but I would like everyone to hear the basic, that important piece of your testimony, if you'd share it this morning.
When we came to Sacramento, I was assigned to Mather Air Force Base in 1979. At that point in time, it wasn't a good place. I wasn't in a good place. I'd damaged my alcohol abuse, had damaged our marriage, and it had damaged my Air Force career. But we stumbled upon Winding Way Community Church just down the road here. Neither one of us were seeking a relationship with Christ. But our daughters, we needed to get them into church because our parents put us into church, so we needed to get them into church. Anyway, the church there came into being Christ Community Church here on this campus here. This sanctuary was one of the first buildings, the Brock and the Evers, back in the back where the vacant lot is. On Palm Sunday of 1982, I was sitting about 4 or 5 rows from the back, and about a third of the way in back there. And Pastor Carl Overbeek was speaking about Jesus carrying that heavy cross up that hill. And he kind of looked in that direction when he said, and he did this for you. Well, at that moment, for you, I was the only you here in this sanctuary. And that's when I became a believer. I gave it up and I turned my life to Christ and continued that journey. And that's where we are today. The journey into Celebrate Recovery, though, is after we retired from the Air Force, returned here to Sacramento. And Pastor Dwayne Decker, in 2001, in July, he sent out a letter saying, we're going to start this Celebrate Recovery ministry. And I had dealt with my alcohol, and I felt the Lord was speaking to me about go to that meeting. And I went to the meeting, but I was looking for something that says to get out of there. And he said, we're going to be meeting every Friday night. And I says, that's it. I can't give up every Friday night of my life. Well, anyway, we went on the next month. 5 of us went to Saddleback Church to the Celebrate Recovery 3-day summit there. And we took my wife with me too. She went, and we had a wonderful time there of learning how to grow a Celebrate Recovery, how to grow leaders within the Celebrate Recovery. And I'll let Becky share with you her trip to Saddleback.
I accompanied Mark and the other 4 that went to Saddleback Summit. Now, my only purpose in going was Laguna Beach was nearby, and I was strictly going for rest and relaxation, and I really didn't understand what Celebrate Recovery was, or I didn't think I had anything that I needed to have Celebrate Recovery for. So each night I would hear the group speak about at dinner time. They were talking about what they had learned, and I was beginning to think, wow, this is a really neat program for people who need help. But I still didn't think I needed any help. On the last night, on a Friday night, they had their actual Celebrate Recovery, and I went with the group to that Celebrate Recovery. As they were walking in, they passed out bulletins, and the group started talking about, oh, I'm going to go to this group, and I'm going to go to that group. And I looked at Mark, and I said, great, just what am I supposed to do? Because I didn't think I needed to go to any group. And he looked at me, and he said, go to the codependent group. Well, I walked in there mumbling and listening to the music and hearing the testimony that was going and everything, but I kept looking at that bulletin. And to this very day, I remember God speaking to me and telling me, go to that guilt and shame group. And when it was over, I can't believe, I hopped up, I looked at Mark, and he says, where are you going? And I said, God told me to go to guilt and shame. And I walked into that group, and for the very first time, 25 years, I identified myself as, hi, I'm Becky, a believer, because if we are in Celebrate Recovery and we know that Jesus Christ is our higher power, I'm going to say, I'm a believer, because I know Jesus is going to see me through. So I said, I'm Becky, a believer who struggles with guilt and shame. Baggage that I had carried around for 25 years was suddenly identified to me. You see, I had had an adulterous year-long affair with my best friend's husband and my husband's best friend, and I didn't know how to handle it. I thought I had it all covered up and it was all taken care of, but it wasn't. So as soon as we got back and the group started and we began a step study, which is a year-long walkthrough on working on your hurts, habits, and hang-ups, and it digs deep into where are you at. It digs into denial. It digs into so many different things. What am I in control of? And working that, we got to the fourth step, which is you have to do a moral inventory. You have to write out everything you've ever done. And in order to do it, I had to be honest. And so by the time I had done it, I had completed that. Then I did my fifth step where I shared what I shared with God, I shared with myself, and one other person what all I had done. And then we worked through that process of the different steps, and then we hit the amends, where we have to learn how to make amends to the people that we have harmed. That was a process. But in the beginning, and then came with that, came the forgiveness. And with forgiveness, I realized I knew Jesus had forgiven me, but I had never forgiven myself, really, for what I had done. And I learned how to, you see, I liked myself, but I didn't love myself. And I really learned how to forgive myself and to love myself. And then came that process of we go through and we complete the step study, and come step 12, yield myself to God. And with that yielding, it talks about writing your testimony. Well, you know, all the other leaders that we had, they were eager to write their testimony. I wasn't. And it took a lot of prayer. It took a lot of time with my sponsor, with my accountability partner. And eventually the Lord laid it upon my heart that I needed to share about my affair with Mark. You know, that was the hardest thing I have ever done. But I'm so grateful that that serenity prayer saw me through. But with that, I shared with Mark. And after that was over, I shared with my daughters. And God knew the plan he had for Mark and I. I didn't know it, but I was able to write my testimony, to share it, and it was amazing things. And one other thing I just want to share with that is, you know, I went back to that Celebrate Recovery Summit the following year, and I was so eager to go to that guilt and shame group and tell people what God had done for me. That group didn't exist anymore. And so I really know God had a plan. And that plan for Mark and I was Celebrate Recovery. Thanks.
Thank you for both of you for being vulnerable and sharing. And I want to highlight a couple things. We don't normally get to do this when someone shares their testimony, but all of you, whether you have a Celebrate Recovery background or not, I want you to hear a couple key details out of Becky's story in particular. She thought that something she had dealt with was dead and buried and wouldn't affect her anymore. The secret hiding in her past. She thought she could put it in the cemetery of her life and that it wouldn't torment her. But the truth is, my friends, you can't be healed through denial. You can't be healed through a lie. You can't be healed by telling yourself a false narrative. You can only be healed by coming humbly to Jesus Christ. And Jesus leads us on the steps. And he's gracious. He's so gracious to Becky that he had prepared Mark. And that's another powerful part of the story we don't get a chance to go through this morning, but he had prepared Mark to be ready to receive this, a man who desperately needed grace and mercy himself. My friends, we don't see God's power, as we were singing and talking about earlier, through our own strength. We see it when we are weak and we recognize our powerlessness and we recognize our need for him. And they were leading in ministry. You know, there's another thing. You can think that because I'm leading a Bible study or I'm leading a ministry that therefore I don't have the same needs as everybody else. I've arrived and they had just as much, if not more, of a need. And it's your credibility as leaders that you work the steps that I believe God has honored the most. So thank you very much. And Mark, on this point, you want to bring this morning 2 Corinthians chapter 12, 9, and 10. Can you say a few words about that?
Leading into it, Paul has a thorn in his side, and today I call it an issue. We don't know what that issue was, but what that thorn was, but a messenger from Satan put that thorn in Paul's side. So in verse 8, Paul cries out to the Lord 3 different times, please remove this thorn from my side. He probably was whining a little bit too. But anyway, here's verse 9, what God said to him. But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That's the creator of the universe saying what? His power is made perfect in our weakness. Then Paul's response to God, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. For Celebrate Recovery, I changed that word boast to share. Therefore, I will share all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. Now, if I sat down with someone and I was sharing about formation flying, acrobatics, or landing in a low visibility approach, or running 7 marathons, they probably couldn't relate too well with me. But if I share with them one-on-one on my weaknesses, my failures, my fears, all the consequences of my poor choices, they wouldn't have those same choices, but I guarantee you they would have some choices that they could relate to, and we could establish a spiritual connection, not a physical connection. We're sharing openly our weaknesses. So now that is why, for Christ's sake, I will delight in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution, and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. For the 2 of us, we were very weak. We didn't know how weak we were when we came into Celebrate Recovery, but we began to share about our weaknesses, and now we have strength that will never be taken away from us.
Let me take a different step with you, Becky. We've shared many times behind the scenes when you and Mark and I have met on more than one occasion. We've commented that when we all grow up, we want to be Dick and Dottie Evers. Now, many of these folks know Dick and Dottie Evers, but can you say a few words about that as well as who they are to us and in particular to you and Celebrate Recovery?
Dick and Dottie Evers are the founders of formerly Winding Way Church and Christ Community Church. And Mark and I came to know them early on in our Celebrate Recovery, when we first came back here to Christ Community Church, prior even to Celebrate Recovery. But anyway, we were always excited because Dick and Dottie would come and join us at Celebrate Recovery on a Sunday night. And often Dick would get up here on the stage and he would share, and it was always beautiful. But there was Dottie, and I just loved visiting with Dottie. And Dottie was always so excited about coming to Celebrate Recovery, and she just loved everyone that came. And the whole thing for Dottie was, when she was a child at church, she always got to go to a church service at 6 o'clock. And Sunday night church service. All right. So there was Dottie on Sunday nights. We had a Sunday night 6 o'clock service, and so Dick and Dottie were always there. And I am so grateful for their mentorship and just how their path that they walked after they left and came about and just did different things in their life. And that's what Mark and I want to do. Thanks.
And there's a couple things there, as far as, and it's not just Celebrate Recovery. Step 12 talks about service, and service matters. And I think it's when you're served that you truly understand what life really is all about. And I want you to hear 4 examples of service here and 4 examples of needs. Mark came with a classic chemical addiction, if you will, in his background, recovering alcoholic. But Becky came with that codependent shame and guilt issue. I'm not even sure how to describe mine sometimes, just a big God-sized hole that I'm constantly trying to fill with the wrong stuff. But it's not necessarily a chemical thing in the classic sense of drugs and alcohol, but it's still the same thing, still trying to use a drug of choice to mask pain and difficulty. And then you have a Dick and Dottie Evers who are there just to be a support and a blessing to the ministry. It's a powerful, powerful thing. And, when you serve, in many ways, I think you're never more close to the heart of God than when you give your life away. And that's what the Lord does for us. So I want to encourage you all. A lot of times we're missing out on what is truly fulfilling in life is because we're just focused on getting rather than giving. And that leads me to this last thing, Mark. Number one, you have a lot of people that you and Becky have touched that have touched you and blessed you. I want you to share that one story and then also what comes next for you as a couple.
The word recovery keeps people away from our ministry because what's your first thought? Drugs and alcohol. That's not my issue. So they explore it no more. This is how God works in a mighty way. We have so many similar to this, but this one family, a 20-something-year-old boy who was living at home, came to Celebrate Recovery. And after he had been here probably about 6 months, his father came because he saw changes in his son. Then later on, his wife came because she saw changes between the two of them. The dynamics in the family were changing. And finally, their daughter came very courageously. But each of them had their own personal issues, different issues, but all 4 combined together resulted in dysfunction within the family. Drugs and alcohol were not an issue in any of their lives. The husband and wife are key leaders in our Celebrate Recovery now. The young man is married, living in Washington, 2 children. Their daughter, I was honored to officiate at her wedding. In December, she had her first baby. God writes these things. We just get to sit there and we get to watch people's lives changed, such as those four. This group up here, I'm going to break your anonymity, but each and every one of them came through the front door of Celebrate Recovery. And they each worked through whatever issue brought them there. And here they are, just beautiful music, beautiful worship. So again, recovery is not just for the addicted. It's for hurts, habits, and hang-ups, those thorns, those issues that may be penetrating. What you think about during the day maybe comes back, or when you put the head on the pillow at night. Those are the issues that need God's help, and we are Christ-centered. It's all about Jesus.
Amen. So you're not going to be leading the ministry anymore. That must mean you're retiring and heading off into the sunset and quitting. Are you quitting?
Well, I found out after the first service that rumors have started that we're moving to Phoenix. And no,
Not started by me. I want to make that clear.
we're staying right here. Yeah. What we will do, or what I will do, I don't know for sure, but I know God has something in mind for us. So we just have to remain open to the urging of the Spirit in our lives. We will still maintain connected to Celebrate Recovery. If Tracy or Cindy have any questions, we will be there to answer those questions the best of our abilities. But there's quite a few things that I haven't done that I'm thinking about. But serving is definitely, we're here at Christ Community. We're not going anywhere. So we're still yours, Pastor.
That's what I wanted to hear. You know, it is not automatic that we hit the finish line. And I think even a recognition, if we had more time to be able to talk about why you do it, how that changed over time, and what the significance is. I think a lot of times folks chase leadership with a desire for recognition, or because they think, that's the way to serve or whatever. And I think both of you have modeled and shown what servant leadership is. And I look forward to one of the things that I've commented on about Dick and Dottie Evers being true of both of you, that you experience the afterglow of a life of service that's been well lived unto the true servant, Jesus Christ. And that blessing that, like Dick and Dottie Evers, I think it can be argued for any of you who knew them when they were back among us after they had retired from formal active ministry, they may well have been at their most effective in those retirement years. You have the opportunity to bless and encourage countless more just with your grace, your presence, your love, and your experience. And may you continue to do it. And you already mentioned, Tracy and Cindy, you have the chance to bless and empower a mantle of leadership to the ones who are taking responsibility to lead and follow your example. So for this last moment of this message this morning, I want to invite you to pray over them. And I want to invite Tracy and Cindy, if you would come up, and the band, if you would come up as we prepare to close, and we want to pray for them. My prayer in particular for Tracy and Cindy is that they would receive a double portion of Mark and Becky's relationship and leadership here at Christ Community, and in particular in Celebrate Recovery, just in the same way that Elijah passed on a double portion of his leadership to Elisha. So Mark, would you please pray for Tracy and Cindy as they take on this mantle of responsibility?
Dear Lord, the four servants standing here, Father, you brought us from some pretty challenging situations to this place of freedom where our spirits can be aligned with yours. And Father, I just thank you for the support that Tracy and Cindy have given Becky and I over the years. Father, we hope to be able to pass that back to them as necessary. But Father, thank you for this church. Thank you for all the support we have gotten through this. Without that, our ministry would have faltered and never came to this point. So Father, thank you for saving us from ourselves. And it's in your Son's name I pray. Amen.